Hi everyone, this is Natalie with Champion of Coins Tarot. I hope that you all are doing very well today. I am here to share a full walkthrough of the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg. This is a US Game Systems deck that was first published in 1991. The version that I have is the 1996 re-release, which included the full companion guidebook by Cynthia Giles. This was very generously gifted to me by a very wonderful subscriber, and the purpose of this video is to be able to translate a lot of the information that is in the guidebook to a broader audience, because while this deck is still in print, the guidebook is out of print. They no longer sell as a full set. And so while the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg is a Rider Waite Smith clone, and it is very accessible in a lot of ways, it's one that you can absolutely pick up and begin reading from scratch without any other context. This guidebook is really indispensable to understanding the specific historical, religious, and cultural references that are infused throughout the deck, and to understand the purpose and thesis of the deck as a whole. So the deck was first commissioned in 1987 by the CEO of US Game Systems, Stuart Kaplan. He had seen the art of Yury Shakov, who is one of the most famous modern Russian miniature artists. Yury Shakov had left the former Soviet Union in the early 1980s and resettled in the United States. And Stuart Kaplan encountered his artwork. He asked him if he would be willing to commission a tarot deck inspired by Russian artwork, and Yury said yes. Now, Yury had no previous knowledge of the tarot system whatsoever. He went out and he purchased a copy of the Tarot de Marseille, he purchased a copy of the Rider Waite Smith, and he purchased a copy of the Classic Tarot, in addition to some reference books about the Thoth Tarot to help inform his understanding. And after a few months of deep study of the different artistic symbols, he sketched out the full 78 cards and began painting his own tarot deck under commission. Unfortunately, Yury passed away unexpectedly in 1989 before he could complete the full deck, and so he was personally responsible for completing the paintings of the Major Arcana and the Suit of Cups in the Minor Arcana. A second artist, who unfortunately is anonymous, was then commissioned by Stuart Kaplan to finish the rest of the deck based off of the sketches that Yury had left behind. One thing that's really, really fascinating to me, and that's so important in understanding what this deck is that it was created before the fall of the Soviet Union by an ex-patriot from Russia. And Yury Shakov really intended this deck to be a love letter to Russian tradition, a love letter to art, a love letter to religion and to myth and to the rich history of the country and of its people that was unfortunately suppressed under decades of communist authoritarian rule. And it was Yury's hope, as it was the hope of many artists at the time who similarly had fled the former Soviet Union, that the inevitable collapse would lead to a rediscovery, a resurgence, and a reclamation of Russian history, and that the almost mythopoetic sense of the Russian people that had been suppressed under communism would one day kind of come back and revitalize and bring life and inspiration to a new generation. And I think that, just if to interject my own personal opinion here, I think that Yury Shakov did a really incredible job. He married different figures and cultural references from the entire span of Russian history to the traditional tarot system in just a really well thought out, cohesive, and loving way. So this video is not going to necessarily be a primer about that history. If you are interested, the first 105 pages of the guidebook go very, very in depth and provide you a summary of Russian history that kind of spans the totality of the early pagan period in Russia, pre-900s AD, the Kievan period where Russia allied itself with the Byzantine Empire and converted to Orthodox Christianity, the Mongol invasions and the segmentation of Russia under various foreign rule, followed by the Muscovite period, in which Russia regained its independence in the 1400s and started the line of czars. It also touches on imperial Russian history, really focusing on the Enlightenment movement and the impact of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great on reforming Russian political and academic systems. And then it concludes with a really in-depth analysis of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet regime under Stalin, and how the communists suppressed Russian history and suppressed Russian art during the 20th century. So this is not meant to be a replacement and an in-depth point-by-point walkthrough of that. However, I am going to be calling out these specific periods and calling out specific figures from these historic periods as we walk through the deck. So we are going to go ahead and start off with none other than the Fool. So the Fool is represented here by a skомorochi, and I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. I do not speak Russian, so this is going to be my very best attempt. But the skомorochi is a traditional wandering performer from old Russia. So these were clowns, minstrels, and puppeteers that would travel across the Kievan countryside, and they would go and perform in the courts of different noblemen. So the Fool here is dressed as one of those medieval figures would be. He's in a very motley, multicolored costume that signals his profession as an entertainer. He's decked out in bells, in rattles, and he's also holding a puppet that looks exactly like himself. And so the puppet was definitely the ubiquitous companion of this kind of traveling artist. And here it really casts a very interesting light on the symbolism of the Fool itself, because it could be seen as perhaps a sign of self-absorption or of narcissism, of the folly of being caught up in the ego or being caught up in frivolity. But it also could be indicative of the wise fool archetype, which is something that's very common in Russian literature, particularly Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot has the character of Prince Mishkin, who embodies this archetype within Russian literature of somebody who is naive and who is good-hearted, but who causes trouble and chaos wherever they go. And so by having the Fool and the puppet together, it could be a symbol of not taking oneself too seriously. It could also be a way of gazing at one's own image and fascination, and being able to laugh at themselves in affectionate wisdom, depending on how the card is drawn and interpreted. Of course, you also do have the traditional elements of the Rider Waite Smith itself, where you have the dog companion who is kind of there as a warning. But yeah, definitely this encapsulates the literal archetype of the Fool in a very interesting historical context. Next is the Magician, and this is one of the most traditional of the Major Arcana that we are going to see in the deck. Not much has changed from the traditional Rider Waite Smith symbolism. You have the Magician who is decked out in red and white. He has the table surrounded by his instruments. The main symbolic difference here is the wings that are present on the infinity symbol or the lemniscate. And this is actually a reference to Crowley's Thoth deck. So of course, Yury Shakov, when he was designing this, he was looking at the 3 different major tarot systems, and he chose to incorporate the wings as a reference to Crowley's interpretation of the Magician as Hermes. And so this calls to mind that winged helmet that we would see in the Thoth Tarot. Another possibility that the wings could represent are the wings of the four evangelists. So those are the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we're actually going to see more callbacks to the gospel writers. Traditionally, we would find them in the World card in the Rider Waite Smith, but Yury Shakov really wanted to bring his own understanding of Russian Orthodoxy to this, and so he scattered more references and more wings throughout the deck, but otherwise quite traditional. The High Priestess is represented by Saint Olga. She was the Princess of Kiev, and she was the first Russian ruler to convert to Christianity. And she was definitely ahead of her time. So she would have converted a little after the year 945, and it took 2 full generations for her grandson to complete the full Christianization of Russia and to formally reject the old polytheistic Slavic paganism of the Russian monarchy and to align themselves with the Byzantine Orthodox Church. So Saint Olga here is definitely almost playing that role of the papist that one would see in a Marseille deck, in which she is definitely the female face of the church, or the female face of this spirituality. But there are definitely some callbacks here to the older and deeper tradition of Russian pagan spirituality. So for one, we can see the lion on the throne, and this is symbolic of this pagan spirit that, though conquered, was still present in Russian art, was still present in Russian folk practices, and that never fully went away. It just continued to transform, and for that wisdom to be embodied in different ways, hidden in plain sight. And then she also, in her left hand, is making a mudra of the Hindu deity Kali in her manifestation as the mother of the world. And so this was also a common mudra. Even though it originated in India, it had spread through cultural syncretism, and it was a common gesture that Russian people would make if they were trying to ward off the evil eye. And so in this card, we see this blending again of this Christianization, but also the incorporation and the perpetuation of alternate modes of spirituality throughout Russian history, which I found to be very, very interesting. Again, you also have calls to traditional tarot symbolism, and so these 2 pillars here are recalling the pillars in the Rider Waite Smith tarot card, and then you also have the red cloth, which is indicative of the veil of mysteries that the High Priestess is often seated in front of. So the Empress is portrayed here as Zoe Paleologus, or the Grand Princess Sophia. She was the second wife of Ivan III, and their marriage was one of the most important political alliances in Russian history. So to backtrack, Zoe was the last princess of the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, and Zoe and her siblings who survived went to Rome, and they were under the care of the papacy for several decades as they grew up. This collapse was important because the Byzantine Empire was the successor to the Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire had once been split into 2 areas of governance, with a concentration of power in Rome and a concentration of power in Byzantium, or kind of modern day Istanbul, Constantinople. So when the Byzantine Empire collapsed, it was also the collapse of this center of Roman tradition and this center of Orthodox religious tradition. And through the marriage between Zoe and Ivan III, the Russian Empire gained the right and the status to be known as the Third Rome. So in this marriage, concentration of power in the Orthodox Church transferred over to Moscow, And the two-headed eagle that is on the crest of the shield here, which had previously been used by the Byzantine Empire, kind of became licensed to Ivan and to his family to use as their official emblem for the new Russian Empire that they were building in Moscow. And so this really amplifies the Empress as mother in the sense of being mother of a nation or mother of a dynasty, of continuing this royal lineage. She also does have aspects of the traditional Empress card. So for example, she is seated in a similar posture, and her dress is covered in flowers and fruit and calls to mind the abundance of nature that is really emphasized in the Rider Waite Smith card. But this is definitely, again, more of a very strong, powerful female leader, and this kind of power that women were able to wield politically through marriage and through continuity. The emperor is Ivan III, her husband. And so an important thing to note about Ivan is that he was able to unite Russia and to create a new concentration of power in the city of Moscow during this period. And under his leadership, they were able to expel the Tartars, which were a Turkish group that had kind of come in and taken over Russian territory during this vast period of decline after the Mongol invasions. So he was able to unite the Russian people, to unite all of these disparate political power heads, and unite the country into one unified territory again. And he used the title of Tsar, which is derived from the Roman title of Caesar, to style himself because of this lineage of the Third Rome that he had adopted through his marriage to Zoe/Sophia. There are a few interesting symbolic references in this card. And so underneath his throne is this pillar that is carved with St. George and the dragon. So St. George is a very famous Christian folkloric saint. There really is no evidence that he was a living figure, but in the story, St. George slays a dragon that has kidnapped a maiden and that has been terrorizing this pagan village, and the community is so grateful that they convert to Christianity. So this symbol on the Emperor card could be seen as an allegory for Ivan III reuniting Russia and being able to conquer or to be able to take back power from this foreign influence that was ruling over much of Russian territory. And we see here in the background is Moscow, the city that he built. So this Emperor card is one that definitely is another concentration of political power, but also speaks to this structure, this order, to being able to unite folks under one singular vision as a charismatic and as a very savvy political leader. This also ties the emperor to the Hierophant card. So the Hierophant is Prince Vladimir, who was the grandson of Olga of Kiev, who we just saw in the High Priestess card. So Olga converted to Orthodox Christianity, but her son did not. And so it wasn't until her grandson Vladimir came to power in Kiev in the late 900s that he converted to Christianity. And he forced all of his subjects and all of the other leaders in the area who were loyal to him to also convert to Christianity. And this was a very violent process. He would go from village to village and forcibly convert people by sword point. And if they did not convert, he would throw them into the river and drown them. That being said, he is also remembered as being one of the most charitable Russian rulers of all time. He heavily invested in the arts. He heavily invested in building up the Orthodox Church as the powerful religious institution in Russia. And that is how he's portrayed, not in his position as warlord or not in his position as monarch, but as a patriarch or a bishop in the Orthodox Church. He is wearing this incredibly ornate robe. He is surrounded by a choir of cherubim. He has this massive halo around him. He is really here enshrined as the father of Russian Orthodox religion. And you can almost see, it's just so finely detailed, but there's a portrait of the Madonna and Child emblazoned upon his chest, and his robe is covered in panels that are directly inspired by Russian Orthodox icons that would be displayed in churches. So here, he is the physical embodiment of the church. He's the physical embodiment of religion and power. Next up is the Lovers, and this is one that is honestly fairly on point with traditional Rider Waite symbolism. Of course, you have the figures who are dressed in traditional Russian costume. You have cherubim who are hanging over their head in place of the angel. You have the tree of life and the tree of knowledge and the snake kind of entwined over here in the background. But what's interesting is that the main focal point here that's representing this duality of choice isn't so much this Christian symbolism, but it's the personified sun and moon themselves. And this was a very common motif to be embroidered on altar cloths in Russian Orthodox churches. And it is meant to signify that all of creation is focused on God. All of creation is in purpose of divinity. And so what's interesting here is that the sun and the moon are pointed at the cherubim, like they are aware of this higher cosmic reality of which they are a part, but the lovers are totally engrossed in one another. They are completely oblivious to the serpent. The man here appears to be a shepherd, and he seems to be oblivious to what's happening with the sheep and the goats. And this is like another reference to Christian scripture as well, specifically to the line Matthew 25:31-46, in which Christ is described as being like a shepherd who would separate the just from the unjust as sheep from the goats. So it's very interesting to see which aspects of religious observance are really emphasized. And it seems to be this local tradition and interpretation of specific verses of the New Testament rather than this older biblical creation story that we would associate the traditional RWS lovers with. Next up, we have the Chariot. And this chariot is fairly traditional, except that as opposed to being static, this is a chariot that is in motion. The charioteer is dressed in battle that's based off of traditional Russian medieval armor. He has the cape billowing behind him. The horses are running off into two completely different directions. And this is very ornately decorated. And it's almost difficult to see, but he has stars emblazoned on his cape. And the carriage itself is a very ornate, decorately carved wooden piece. And so it's almost like more indicative of a traveling artist's cart, more so than it would be any actual practical tool for warfare. And then it's almost impossible to see. But in the center, you have Yury Shakov's initials. This is the one card in the entire deck that he opted to sign for himself. Card number 8 is the Strength card, and this, of course, depicts the traditional Rider Waite Smith imagery of the woman who is embracing the lion. The lion, of course, is emblematic of strength, of majesty, courage, and fortitude, and it also played a really interesting role in Russian folk religion. There's a story that was attributed to Saint Jerome in which he removed a thorn from the lion's paw. And we actually have the cave right here in the background, kind of representing that story and that link of the lion, and this strength and this power with the gentleness and the humility of monastic life. Additionally, we also have a windmill in the background, and the windmill is a representation of man's ability to draw strength from nature. So just as the maiden in this figure is drawing strength or having this deep relationship with the lion, the windmill is representative of Russian society having this deeper communion and having this interaction with natural forces. So the maiden here is implied to be a virgin. She is unmarried. She has the kind of signature hairstyle of unmarried women in medieval Russia, a single plait and a flower crown. And so this also is indicative of like this purity and this innocence within strength. Ninth card is the Hermit, and he is depicted here as a wandering monk. He has the traditional lantern with the six-pointed star from the Rider Waite Smith imagery. However, Yury has added some additional details. So he is holding a crooked staff that is very similar to the one that the male figure in the Lover's card was holding. And he is also flanked on both sides by mountains and by a cave. And so just as we were looking at the cave in the Strength card earlier, cave systems in Russia were traditionally home to monasteries. One of the biggest one was actually the Monastery of the Caves, which was on the banks of the Dnieper River outside of Kiev. And so Russian monastic tradition was heavily influenced by an Eastern Orthodox mystical movement known as Hesychism. I hope that I'm pronouncing that right. But this was kind of started around Greece, Syria, kind of the south of Eastern Europe. And this movement taught that man could achieve direct personal contact with God through developing practices of fasting, of meditation, of controlled breath, and continuous prayer. And so these monasteries really became a hub for this kind of mystical embodied teaching. And one of the folk traditions about the monastery was that by engaging in these practices, the monks inside were accumulating powerful spiritual energy, and they were able to push that out into the surrounding landscape around them. So this really embodies almost in a sense another holdover from paganism within the Russian worldview, in which nature could be transformed by the actions of holy people. So this hermit is very much associated with that kind of contemplation and the ability to transform the outer world by transforming one's inner spiritual landscape. I thought it would be interesting to put these two cards into conversation with one another for a moment. So we already discussed the Fool as the Skamarochi, as this traveling minstrel and performer. You also do have a traveling monastic tradition in which you have these solo monks leaving their monasteries and going from town to town across the Russian countryside, giving out sermons and prophetic utterances. And so these were termed as holy fools. One more modern example that I think most folks would be familiar with is Rasputin, right? This traveling religious figure who becomes embroiled in the last czar's inner circle and family. But yeah, there definitely is this tradition of both having these traveling performers being termed as fools, and kind of poking fun and poking light at society through satire, and also poking fun at themselves through this use of the puppet. But then you also have the wandering hermit or the wandering monk, who is someone who is drawing attention to larger religious themes or larger moral issues through their teaching as well. So I thought it was very, very interesting that I think both of these kind of paint a full picture of what the role of the wanderer played in Russian life. The Wheel of Fortune here is rather similar to the Rider Waite Smith Wheel of Fortune, in that the wheel is embellished with the Hebrew letters that form the Tetragrammaton, or the unnamed name of God. It's also surrounded by the four beasts representing the evangelists, the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, along with the Egyptian figure of Typhon, the snake. However, there are a few interesting things to note. So one is that the Sphinx at the very top of the wheel is actually Peter the Great, who was responsible for bringing the Enlightenment to Russia. And a very funny thing about Peter the Great is that he was known in life for having a very fabulous mustache, and political cartoons would satirize him as a cat because of the mustache. And so this is kind of calling upon this tradition of political commentary. Another interesting thing to note is that we have rota, or wheel, which is written out here, similar to the Rider Waite Smith. But rota actually refers to a very specific political system within the Kievan period. So from 1036 to 1054, Yaroslav I, or Yaroslav the Wise, was reigning over Kievan Russia, and he had the problem of inheritance. He had 5 sons, and they needed to figure out who was going to inherit political power after his death. And so he created this system called rota, in which his 5 sons would each rule over the 5 principal cities in the kingdom. The richest city went to the eldest son, and so on down the line. And when the eldest son would die, then the next brother would move up and inherit that city, and the eldest brother's son would inherit the least rich city. And so it was kind of like this ranking system where everybody would cycle through and have the chance to rule over a particular city. However, the sons did not die in the same order as they were born, as one could probably imagine. And this devolved into chaos. It devolved into the selfish and petty infighting amongst the brothers that Yaroslav was trying to avoid by setting up the system. And because of this political infighting, it contributed to the decline of their military power, and ultimately their conquest by the Mongolian army, and then by the Tartar army coming out of the Turkish area, and so on and so forth. So knowing about this system of power really helps to color and contextualize this depiction of the Wheel of Fortune in the broader cultural landscape and historic landscape of Russia. So next we have Justice, and this is actually one of the most pagan cards in the entire deck. So Justice here is depicted as a goddess. She is in traditional Russian dress, of course. However, she has an 8-pointed star at the top of her head illuminating her and connecting her to divinity. And she's standing in front of a very ornately carved archway. So the arch was a very important architectural element in ancient Slavic religious centers. This particular arch is a reproduction of an idol that was found in the Polish River, and it represents the war god Svantovit, whose 4 faces show out on all 4 directions of the pillars. So this harkens back to this period that we were talking about earlier, and the forced conversion of the pagan tribes to Orthodox Christianity, as they would go from town to town and they would force people to either convert or to die. They not only threw the bodies of massacred peoples into the river system, but they also dismantled the pagan shrines, and they threw the pagan shrines into the river. And so that's how archaeologists were able to find and to reconstruct this element. This one also, in addition to having the face of the war god, it's also embellished with dragons and with the sun. And the sun was the most important symbol in Slavic pagan religious tradition. And the imagery of the sun became syncretized with the Orthodox iconography that Russians adopted later on in their history. And so this is really talking about a justice that is not so much a matter of laws, but that is very intimately connected to the natural world, to the rhythms and cycles of the seasons, to this understanding of nature itself, and this idea that justice or a kind of natural order can come out of seeing oneself as a part of this larger cosmic dance. Next card is the Hanged Man, and this one looks very similar to the Rider Waite Smith. However, there is one very, very important element, and that is the element of the Firebird. The Firebird is a very important character in many Russian folk tales, and this one harkens specifically to a tale about Ivan Tsarevich, who was a prince who was set to tend his father, the king's apple orchards. And every night the Firebird would come and it would eat all of the apples. So Ivan waited patiently, and he was able to catch the Firebird and pluck a feather from its tail. And that feather was magical, and so Ivan was then able to use it to both vanquish one of his political rivals, but also to win love and to win abundance. And so this is really portraying him in the orchard, lying in wait for this creature to come, and it casts a very interesting light as the Hangman. I think that there is definitely more of an active presence, like more of a period of preparation or a state of agency in which you are willing yourself to wait for the right opportunity, as opposed to the Hanged Man image in other decks in which there maybe is not as much choice in the matter, that this act of surrendering might be something that is forced upon someone by fate, as opposed to being attributed to their own agency and their own ingenuity. The Death card is one of the most fascinating to me because we have this entire scene of death, this battle, but the majority of the image is taken up by this very large skull. And not only that, but the mustache and the mouth still appear to be alive. So this was a very deliberate choice. The mustache is that of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. Terrible is a bit of a misnomer. I believe that the actual name translates more to awesome, kind of embodying like both this fear but also acknowledging the greatness of what Ivan was able to achieve. He was definitely one of the most successful rulers in Russian history. However, he had an uncontrollable temper, and he was known for massacring political rivals, for leaving nothing unturned on the battlefield, and sadly for accidentally killing his own son by striking him out of anger. Another thing is that Ivan IV is often thought to perhaps have had bipolar disorder. And I think that there are some problems with being able to diagnose historic figures using modern medical language. But he was somebody who was he would have these really intense, almost manic fits of rage. But then on the other side, he would go through these very intense depressive periods where he would devoutly pray, he would do all of these massive works of charity in order to try to atone for what he did. There seems to be just this kind of like lack of control over himself, which is very fascinating. And so, of course, death in the tarot is quite symbolic of transformation, of profound change, of moving through this cycle of destruction and renewal. And so it is interesting that Ivan IV is here as somebody who really went back and forth between these two extremes and often had to grapple with the consequences of his violent actions. The Temperance card is another one that is very, very similar to the traditional Rider Waite Smith depiction. We have an angel who is combining or pouring this water between two different vessels. One important thing to note, though, is that this angel is readily identified as Raphael, because in Renaissance Orthodox artwork, Raphael was often depicted with this backpack on and these straps across his chest as a traveler. There is a story in the Book of Tobit, which is an apocryphal text of the Bible, in which a stranger appears and accompanies a young man named Tobias on a journey. And in the end, it was revealed that Raphael was walking with him, and Raphael is able to perform miracles and to heal folks along the way. So by identifying this angel as specifically being Raphael, it really emphasizes this healing, this restoration after the intensity of death in the previous card. And it's also a very interesting Easter egg about art history. In the 19th century, the Russian intelligentsia was very fascinated with Renaissance Italian artwork. And one of the painters that they revered as being the most important was the artist Raphael, and particularly his depictions of the Madonna and Child. And so these academics would frequently go on holiday, and they would take pilgrimages to Italy and to Dresden and just these other centers in which Raphael's artwork was displayed. And so because temperance is often called art in Thoth systems, I thought it was very interesting that we have that tie-in as well. Now this Devil card and the subsequent Tower card are the two most powerful political statements that Yury Shakov makes in the entirety of the Major Arcana, and that's because we are beginning to deal with the USSR and communism and authoritarianism. So the devil himself is portrayed as being none other than Joseph Stalin, and taken in its entirety, this picture of Stalin ruling over the subjects of Russia is symbolic of the mass death and starvation that happened during Stalin's regime. Millions of Russians died, either because they were killed outright by the state and were accused of being political enemies, or they were killed out of negligence because of this lack of resource distribution that contributed to widespread famines after World War II. And so here, these folks are literally enslaved to the representation of communist rule himself. There is a lot of symbolism packed into the way that Yury particularly chose to portray Stalin. So one is that Stalin is covered in tattoos, the most striking of which are the eyes across his chest. This is symbolic of the KGB, or the secret police, who spied on everyone in the country. And it signified that under communist rule, folks were never truly free. They were always under constant watch and constant surveillance. He's also depicted with a few other tattoos. So one of them is, of course, the heart with an arrow pierced through that's representative of suffering. He also has some numerals and some script. So one of the tattoos is of the number 34, which refers to the year 1934, when Stalin began the first Great Purge that wiped out his political enemies. He also has the words "for homeland" on his right arm and "for party" on his left arm. He has a snake entwined with a sword on his left arm, and then on his right arm he also has an open book, which is meant to represent Marx's Communist Manifesto. Finally, he is portrayed as having bat wings, and this is a very overt reference to vampirism. Vampires have a very long history in the folklore of Russia and of Eastern Europe. And so not only has he chained the subjects of Russia to authoritarian rule, but he is also sucking the lifeblood out of them by suppressing their religion, by suppressing their history and their material culture. So all in all, this is, again, one of the most profound political statements. And this is immediately followed, of course, by the falling tower. And this is symbolic of the Bolshevik Revolution itself in 1917. The tower is a traditional Russian bell tower, and we're going to see the motif of the bell in quite a few places throughout the deck. Bells were very celebrated religious instruments. They not only announced holidays, funerals, and festivals, but they also were sacred instruments of worship, and bells of every single size, of every single metal, were highly prized and were used in religious worship. In addition to this being a bell tower, there are other symbols of Russian religion that are falling out of this explosion. So we have the imperial crown representing the czars and the monarchy. There's the Russian Orthodox cross, the chalice and censer used in religious rites, and gold coins. There also is what appears to be a kvash, or a drinking vessel. And it is all looked over by a very disapproving son. So one of the hallmarks of the Bolshevik Revolution was not only the destruction of the imperial regime, but of the Orthodox Church itself. And religion was eventually entirely banned under communist rule. So the culture of old Russia, this vibrant color, symbolism, religious ceremony, both pagan and Christian, were all deeply suppressed. And the sad reality is that while the Bolshevik Revolution was intended to try to address the massive gaps in wealth and inequality within Russian society, none of that wealth was actually redistributed to the people who needed it most. It was just replacing one oppressive system with another. And so this card, if we had, a commentary about the oppressiveness of just the political power and the political system in which folks found themselves tied to, we see here what, in Yury's opinion, was the biggest tragedy, which is this loss of art, this loss of religious sentiment and of mysticism and of folk material culture. But of course, after the tower, we have the star. This is another one that deviates from the Rider Waite Smith and is very closely tied into the resilience that can be found within Russian history. So the star here is a mortal woman. She's not an angel. She's not a goddess, as other decks might have chosen to depict this image. She is still pouring the water out, pouring it into the river and onto the land, which symbolizes, of course, the circular flow of energy between heaven and earth. So a few deviations that we have, though, are that the bird has been replaced with a butterfly, which is a Christian symbol that represents the resurrection of Christ. And then we also have another reference here to resurrection with this discarded robe that is on the bank of the river. And so if we are to take these two together, the woman represents the embodied soul. So the aspect of ourselves in which we are alive, we are embodied, we are part of the material world. And the discarded robe and the butterfly represent the soul after death, leaving the body, being released back into the greater cosmos and the greater dance of existence and unity with the divine. In the background, we have an encampment of soldiers. And this is done specifically in the style of the tents that the Russian army used during the Napoleonic Wars. So the Napoleonic Wars are quite famous because the Russians, although they were vastly outnumbered by Napoleon's forces, and they did not have the same advancements in military technology, they were able to hold the French army back for months, until ultimately the harshness of the Russian winter did Napoleon's forces in and they retreated. And so this, coming after the Bolshevik Revolution, coming after the symbolism of the Stalin regime, this points to a very hopeful moment in Russian history that emphasizes their strength, their resiliency, their independence. And it is this card that embodies Yury Shakov's hope that after the fall of the former Soviet Union, which unfortunately he was not alive to see, that this same spirit would return and that the Russian people would be able to carve out a new independent future for themselves. Card 18 is the Moon, and this one is quite interesting because this blends together some of even pre-Marseille style tarot imagery with the traditional moon and dogs and towers and crayfish on the Rider Waite Smith card, specifically that of the telescope. There is a tradition of some pre-Marseille tarot decks having the moon card be represented by astronomers who are looking at the sky with scientific instruments. And so that is why he chose to put the telescope here. However, it is in the background of the card. And this is meant to reference the fact that Russia's Enlightenment movement under Peter the Great lagged so far behind that of other developed European countries at the time. The vast majority of Russians were actually very skeptical to adopt European modes of dress and to adopt European modes of education. They really clung hard to their combined pagan folklore and Orthodox Christianity and rejected some of the ideas about Earth being, not the center of the cosmos, but of being a planet rotating around the sun. Or they rejected the use of new science and new technology in favor of keeping with their traditional practices. And it really wasn't until the Bolshevik Revolution that you saw this vast interest in science and technology begin to emerge as a means of becoming more competitive and of building up the new communist regime with formidable tools that would put them on the same level as democratic powers. So it's just interesting that that's relegated to the background. And instead, you have this almost mystical scene here. You have a ferryman who is crossing the river Volga, and he is styled after Charon, the ferryman who takes the souls of the dead across the river Styx. And so it's, even though this particular myth is one that is outside of the context of Russian religion, it's very interesting to see almost like these universal aspects that have been placed onto the moon card, of being able to realize that this fascination with a mythopoetic worldview is something that spans across all cultures, and this kind of exchange again between like Greek ideas and Russian ideas commingling in this dark liminal space on the card. Then card 19, the Sun, is kind of your traditional standard sun card. The sun is huge in this image. It almost dwarfs the child on the horse. And the sunflowers in particular are something important to note because in Russia they are seen as a symbol of resilience and steadfastness. So there is a Russian Orthodox writer who is quoted explicitly in the guidebook, and unfortunately I don't have many more details beyond that, but the quote is, "Even in darkest days, the sunflower completes its circular course, following the sun by unchangeable love and natural inclination. May our love to our sun, the will of God, be strong enough to draw us inseparably to it in days of misfortune and sorrow, even as the sunflower in dark days continues without faltering." Definitely, again, continuing this theme that we saw in the star card of renewed hope, resilience, optimism. It's important to note that, again, the sun is a very important pagan symbol that has been syncretized in this quote with Christ, another point of cultural exchange and syncretism. Judgement is also quite similar, but there are a few really, really interesting details to note here. So we have the angel who is presiding over these figures who have risen from the grave after hearing the call of the trumpet. The banner that's fluttering on the trumpet is the Greek cross for the Greek Orthodox Church, where all the graves themselves have the traditional Russian Orthodox cross on them. And so there is this sense of this religious lineage of the Russian Orthodox Church coming out of the Greek Orthodox one. You also have a small stone angel that is adorning one of the graves. And this is meant to be a symbolic representation of the real angel that is above, and showing that our earthly signs, our earthly symbols, participate in some higher level of meaning. That in a way, the symbols are just hollow, and that they point to a deeper life, a deeper spiritual reality that is beyond our comprehension. The figures themselves are covered in vines, and so this at once seems to suggest the decay of the body in the grave, but also the vines are a very interesting motif that recurs in a lot of Russian folklore, in which the vine is associated with tenacity and also with the larger pagan tradition of revering the earth as a mother goddess. And so there's kind of this marrying of nature once more with this higher Christian cosmology. This angel is also explicitly identified in the guidebook as being the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel, or Gabriel, is the annunciator who informs Mary that she is going to be the mother of God. She is going to give birth to Jesus. The angel Gabriel is also the angel who gives the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. And so here he's come again to announce this last judgment. And finally, we have the World card to close out the Major Arcana. And this one is quite similar to the Rider Waite Smith, with, of course, the exception that the woman here is dressed in the kokoshnik headdress, which is a traditional Russian folk dress. She's flanked by the evangelists, just like in the Rider Waite Smith card. However, she is standing in front of the globe. And this is meant to be a copy of the first image of Earth as seen from space from the orbital satellite Sputnik, which was launched by the Soviet Union in 1958. And so here we have a celebration of what positive contributions to science the communist regime was able to make. However, at the same time, Yury Shakov is once again doubling down on this political sentiment, and is almost saying that as our knowledge increases, so does our realization that we have so much to learn. That we realize that as the communist vision of life is collapsing, these unscientific values of imagination, of beauty, and belief that have sustained old Russia are going to reassert themselves, and that there is going to be this new marriage between the scientific mind and the folk spirit of the people in the new Russia. So I thought that this was like really, really powerful, and I think definitely is one of the most simple but also one of the most profound depictions of the World card that I have seen in tarot. So I thought it might be interesting to close by putting several of the Major Arcana together to form this timeline of Russian history as a recap for just the breadth of information that the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg covers. So of course we start with Justice, who is this figure of a pre-Christian pagan Russia with the archway, with the sun and the symbols of Slavic gods and the system of worship of nature, to Olga converting to Orthodox Christianity in the 900s during the Kievan phase, Vladimir taking the lineage of his grandmother and Christianizing the entirety of Kievan Russia at that time, the Lovers, where we begin to see these, like this natural pagan cosmology syncretized with biblical narrative and biblical symbols. The rise of monasticism, and again, this interplay between Russian religious monastic life and its influence on the natural world. The Rota system of inheritance, which brought the Kievan Russian period to an end. The resurgence of political power and renewed authority through the marriage of Zoe and Ivan III, which establishes Russia as the Third Rome and concentrates both political and religious power in Moscow. In the 1400s, Ivan IV and his complicated lineage of destruction and repentance in the death card. Strength, showing again this relationship between nature but also encroaching industrialization with the windmill. The moon, signifying the tension and the polarization during the Enlightenment era under Peter the Great's rule, and this emphasis on continuing folk traditions, on continuing to adhere to this religious and folkloric cosmological framework and relegating science to the background. The hope and resiliency demonstrated during Russia under Napoleonic invasion in the Star. The Bolshevik Revolution and the attempted destruction and repression of religious and cultural ties. The Devil, showing the full brutality of life underneath Stalin's regime and indeed the entirety of the USSR. Ending with the world. Ending with this renewed sense of optimism and the belief that the spirit of the Russian people would be able to overcome the oppression of communism, to be able to overcome the death and destruction of the 20th century, and to be able to re-enter the world stage, to continue to embrace science and technology, but at the same time to remember the core essence of their culture and heritage. So that's where I'm going to leave this video. In part 2, I am going to talk about the symbolism in the Minor Arcana, and I'm also going to talk more about this specific style of Russian miniature painting, and to compare and contrast elements that are very emblematic of Yury Shakov's work versus the art style of the second artist who was commissioned to come in and complete the Minor Arcana after Yury's unfortunate death. But I hope that this was very helpful for understanding the just intensity and enormity of this project that Yury Shakov took on, to be able to pull apart as many historic and religious and cultural symbols in the Major Arcana as I possibly could, to offer you just a broader depth of understanding. As always, if you have the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg, or if you are interested in learning more about it, I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Let me know if any of this information was new to you or useful to you, or if there's anything that I did not cover. I would love to know, so that way I can address some of those follow-up questions in the part 2 as well. As always, I am sending you all much love and many blessings as you walk along your own path. Bye.